The last hinge of the antique grandfather clock, a late Georgian piece I'd spent 6 months coaxing back from splintered silence, clicked into place with a satisfying thud. I ran a gloved finger over the polished walnut, feeling the faint warmth of the timber beneath the fresh shellac. Perfection. That was my aim, always. To strip away the grime, the neglect, the ravages of time, and reveal the true, intended beauty beneath. My workshop, a meticulously organized sanctuary of chisels, sandpaper, and rare wood oils, hummed with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. This clock was the last piece. The last lingering tie to my old life, to the predictable rhythm of commissions and restorations that had defined me for years. Now, a new rhythm beckoned, or perhaps, a complete lack of one. A distant relative, a great aunt I'd never met, had passed, leaving me a house. Not just any house, according to the solicitor's terse letters, but a manor. An old, isolated manor, deep in the countryside, miles from anywhere. A place, the solicitor had implied with a subtle shudder in his voice, that had seen better days and then some. The drive was long, the tarmac giving way to gravel, then to a track that seemed to be reclaiming itself with weeds and encroaching brambles. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, pressed down on the landscape, making the late afternoon feel like the cusp of twilight. My sedan, usually a quiet hum of German engineering, felt small and vulnerable against the encroaching wildness. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just a change of scenery, it felt like a crossing over. Finally, a break in the trees. And there it was. The manor didn't just stand, it loomed. A hulking, gray stone leviathan, its slate roof sagged in places like a broken spine. Windows, dark and blank, stared out like vacant eyes. The once grand facade was streaked with centuries of grime, and ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the crumbling stonework, pulling it apart brick by slow brick. A vast, skeletal oak, its branches twisted into arthritic limbs, stood guard by what remained of a wrought iron gate, half swallowed by rust and overgrown hedges. No welcoming light, no sign of life. I cut the engine. I hauled my toolkit from the boot, a heavy leather case filled with the specialized instruments of my trade. This wasn't just neglect, this was a war lost long ago. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak adorned with a tarnished lion's head knocker, creaked open with a groan that echoed deep within the house. The air was frigid, stagnant, and tasted of mildew and decay. A grand staircase, its banister carved with elaborate, forgotten beasts, swept upwards into impenetrable gloom. Cobwebs, thick and heavy as shrouds, draped from every chandelier, every cornice, every forgotten corner. I walked deeper, my footsteps crunching on what felt like centuries of fallen plaster and broken glass. Each room I passed was a tableau of faded grandeur and utter ruin. Furniture, once elegant, was now skeletal, draped in white sheets that looked like ghosts frozen in time. My initial professional appraisal, the thrill of a grand project, the challenge of restoration, was quickly being eclipsed by something else. A gnawing unease. This place felt less like an inheritance and more like a trap. It looked out of place, too stark, too utilitarian for the ornate decay surrounding it. Curiosity, a powerful current, pulled me towards it. It turned with surprising ease, and the door swung inward without a sound, revealing a narrow, descending stone staircase. It smelled of dust and something metallic, something sterile and forgotten. I flicked on my powerful LED torch, its beam cutting a sharp swathe through the inky blackness. The stairs led to a low-ceilinged corridor, narrower than any in the main house, lined with a series of thick, windowless wooden doors, each secured with an immense, rusted bolt. There were no decorative flourishes, no attempt at grandeur. Just raw, unyielding function. My breath hitched. The air here was utterly dead, devoid of even the faint draft that stirred the cobwebs upstairs. I walked forward, my boots echoing unnaturally loud on the stone floor. These weren't storerooms. These weren't cellars. I knew what this was, even if I couldn't comprehend why it was here, hidden beneath a decaying manor. My torch beam landed on the worn, faded numbering above one of the bolted doors, then drifted to a small, barred aperture set at eye level. Inside, a bare, concrete box, utterly devoid of comfort or light. This was a place of deliberate confinement. A place that felt designed to break a person down, piece by piece. Are segregation unit isolation cells doing in this house? The very phrase seemed to suck the last vestiges of warmth from the air. The air inside the manor was a stagnant, cold breath, smelling of damp earth, forgotten paper, and something metallic, like old pennies left too long in a puddle. Every footfall on the wide, creaking floorboards echoed, swallowed by the vast silence that pressed in from all sides. It wasn't just quiet, it was an active absence of sound, as if the house itself held its breath. I chose the library study first. It seemed the logical starting point, a room likely filled with objects, books, and the kind of intricate wooden details that were my specialty. Books lay scattered, their pages fused by time and moisture. A massive desk, its surface warped, sat like a forgotten titan in the center. My gaze, however, was drawn to the built-in shelving and paneling that lined the walls, a symphony of carved wood, now obscured by generations of grime. Setting my toolkit on a relatively stable side table, I unlatched it. The familiar glint of my chisels, brushes, and solvents offered a small, reassuring spark of normalcy. I began by clearing a small section of the wall paneling near the fireplace, using a soft brush to dislodge the thick layer of dust and cobwebs. As I worked, a sound drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, a faint, rhythmic tap. 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 It was too irregular to be a dripping pipe, too soft to be the wind. I paused, brush midair, straining to listen. Nothing. I dismissed it, attributing it to the manor's age and my own overactive imagination. I moved on, carefully examining a particularly ornate section of carving near a disused window. I needed a specific, fine-tipped probe to test the integrity of the wood beneath the varnish. I just used it to scrape away a stubborn patch of residue from a lower panel, setting it down on the edge of my open toolkit. Now, it wasn't there. My brow furrowed. I was certain I'd placed it right beside the tiny bottle of wood restorative. I checked the table, the floor, ran my hand over the toolkit's felt lining. A prickle of annoyance, followed by a flicker of unease, stirred within me. Had I put it back in the wrong compartment? I was rarely so careless. My tools were an extension of myself, each with its designated place. After a moment of fruitless searching, I spotted it. Not in the kit, not on the table, but on the floor, several feet away, nestled against the leg of the heavy desk. It lay perfectly flat, almost deliberately placed. That's odd, I mumbled, bending to retrieve it. My mind offered up explanations. I must have nudged it, it rolled, I hallucinated putting it in the kit. But the desk leg was a solid anchor, it wouldn't have rolled that far. I shook my head, blaming fatigue, and returned to my task, a new, subtle tension tightening my shoulders. The afternoon light, thin and watery through the grimy windows, began to fade. It was gone before I could properly turn my head, leaving only the impression of something tall and slender, just beyond the threshold. I stood perfectly still, my probe forgotten in my hand. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that I was alone in this vast, decaying structure. I slowly turned, scanning the doorway, then the entire room. Only the dust motes dancing in the weak light, the silent, crumbling grandeur. My heart, usually a steady drum, began to tap out a faster rhythm. This wasn't the house settling, this wasn't my imagination. Driven by an impulse I couldn't explain, I started examining the paneling with renewed intensity, not just for restoration, but for any hidden mechanism, any secret. My fingers traced the intricate carvings, pressing, testing. Near the fireplace, where the paneling met the stone hearth, I felt a faint give, a subtle shift that didn't feel like mere decay. I pressed harder, feeling a spring-loaded click, almost imperceptible. The passage led downwards, a crude, unmortared stone staircase descending into absolute blackness. It wasn't a servant's passage or a hidden wine cellar. The construction felt different, older, more utilitarian, designed for concealment and containment. Each chamber was barely large enough for a cot, if one had ever been there, and had a heavy, unadorned iron door, thick and formidable, set into the rough stone. There were no windows, no amenities, just bare, cold stone walls, floor, and ceiling. This wasn't a part of the house meant for living. It was designed for holding. The thought sent a shiver through my core. What kind of secrets did this manor truly hold, that it needed such a place? I backed away slowly, my light beam trembling. It was as if the ancient, suffocating despair of that hidden place had been stirred awake, and was now reaching out, an unseen hand brushing against my mind. The faint tap. Tap. My restoration work was forgotten. I needed to get out, to breathe air that hadn't been trapped for centuries with such palpable sorrow. As I retreated from the hidden passage, I could almost feel eyes on my back, the weight of an unseen presence growing, a silent, hungry anticipation. The house wasn't just settling. It was waking up. And it was watching me. Every footfall on the grand, dust-shrouded entrance hall's parquet floor echoed with a hollow, almost mocking resonance. The wood, once gleaming, was now a dull patchwork of warped panels, each step a creaking protest against my intrusion. I navigated through the gloom, the beam of my heavy-duty flashlight cutting a path through motes of ancient dust dancing in the slivers of weak daylight that pierced the grimy windows. The air, as I'd noted, was a stagnant, cold breath, smelling of damp earth, forgotten paper, and that unsettling metallic tang, like old pennies left too long in a puddle, but sharper, somehow. This room was vast, draped in tattered sheets that hinted at the skeletal remains of furniture beneath. I pulled one back from what might have been a grand piano, revealing only warped wood and rusted strings. I spent the better part of the morning simply assessing, making notes in my small pad, the graphite scratching a lonely rhythm. The ceiling plaster was crumbling, water stains bloomed like grotesque fungi across the wallpaper, and every surface was coated in a thick, greasy film of grime. My restorer's eye, usually thrilled by the challenge of decay, found itself battling a growing sense of unease. There was something wrong here, beyond the structural damage. It was in the library, a room even more choked with dust and forgotten things, that I first felt it. I was trying to pry open a stubbornly stuck window shutter, hoping to let in some actual light. The wood was swollen, ancient, refusing to yield. I leaned into it, grunting, when my hand brushed against a section of the oak paneling on the wall beside the window frame. It felt different. Not just the grime, but a subtle give, a slight rattle where there should have been solid wood. I paused, my breath catching. Years of working with old structures had honed my senses to these minute discrepancies. I ran my fingers over the panel again, tracing the line of the grain. There was a faint seam, almost imperceptible, hidden by centuries of varnish and dust. It didn't align with the natural divisions of the paneling. Retrieving a thin, flexible probe from my toolkit, I carefully worked it into the hairline crack. A faint click, almost inaudible, echoed in the quiet room. Something dry and papery, like ancient, decaying parchment. It was a shallow space, a hidden compartment built into the thick stone wall. Inside, nestled on a small, dusty shelf, were two items. The other was a bundle of brittle, yellowed papers tied with a faded velvet ribbon. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the papers first. They crackled under my touch. Untying the ribbon, I unfolded the topmost sheet. It was a crude, hand-drawn map, marked with faded ink. Not of the manor itself, but of the surrounding estate, with strange, angular lines indicating structures I didn't recognize. My mind raced, trying to contextualize. Was this some forgotten medical wing? A private infirmary for a family prone to strange ailments? The vague, disturbing local history I'd been anticipating was now laid out before me, albeit in fragments. The papers continued, detailing protocols for observation and containment, mentioning the erosion of self in those housed within. As I absorbed these cryptic words, a strange sensation washed over me. I looked up from the papers, my gaze sweeping across the dusty library, trying to recall what I had been doing just before I found the compartment. I remembered the stuck window shutter, the paneling. But for a fleeting, disorienting moment, I couldn't quite grasp why I had been trying to open the shutter in the first place. Was it for light? Of course, for light. But the thought felt foreign, as if someone else had made the decision. I shook my head, a dull ache beginning behind my eyes. Just stress, I muttered aloud, the sound swallowed by the cavernous room. Too much dust, too much quiet. I attributed it to the isolation, the sheer weight of the manor pressing down on me. But the feeling lingered, a subtle wrongness, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refused to materialize. It was a tiny crack in the foundation of my own mind, easily dismissed, yet undeniably there. I looked back at the papers, then at the carved wooden box. It felt connected. And for a moment, I forgot what I was supposed to do with the box. Was I meant to open it? Or put it back? My hands hovered, uncertain. Afflicted? I stood in the doorway, the air in this lower level colder, heavier, than anywhere else in the manor. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood mixed with dust, pricked at my nostrils. The cells themselves were simple, brutal, heavy wooden doors with small, barred peepholes, leading into cramped, windowless spaces. No beds, no furniture, just rough stone walls. Who had been kept here, and why? The questions gnawed at me, a relentless itch under my skin. I couldn't stay down there. The silence was too profound, the weight of whatever had transpired within those walls too oppressive. I sealed the entrance behind me, not bothering with the padlock, just needing to put a barrier between myself and that unsettling discovery. The manor's past, I realized, wasn't just hidden, it was actively resisting discovery. I set up my laptop on a rickety table in what might have once been a study, the air thick with the scent of decaying leather and forgotten paper. My usual meticulous approach to research felt urgent now, tinged with a growing unease. I started with the manor's name, then the family name I'd found on some old deeds. The internet was a labyrinth of fragmented information. Old newspaper archives, digitized local history records, obscure genealogical sites. There were mentions, always vague, of the peculiar temperament of the residents, of unexplained departures, of a period of great distress. One article, yellowed and barely legible, spoke of a local gentleman of considerable means who had succumbed to a profound melancholy, believing himself pursued by phantoms. Another, from a later period, detailed the sudden, simultaneous disappearance of several servants, chalked up to opportunistic flight, though the language carried an undercurrent of doubt. There were no bodies, no investigations of consequence, just a collective shrug from the past. Madness, disappearances, strange occurrences, the very things I'd been looking for, now staring back at me from the digital ether, each fragment more unsettling than the last. The house creaked and groaned around me, familiar sounds now imbued with a sinister undertone. I felt watched, not by a person, but by the house itself, by something within it. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fractured thing. I plunged into a nightmare so vivid it left me gasping. I was in the manor, but it was subtly wrong. The walls pulsed with a faint, sickly light, and the air was thick with a scent I couldn't place, something like ozone and old iron. I was searching for something, a name, a face, something vital, but it kept slipping away. They were calling me something else, something I didn't recognize, yet it felt disturbingly familiar. I woke with a jolt, my heart hammering, the phantom scent of ozone still clinging to my senses. The next day, the unease deepened. I found myself staring at a half-finished restoration project, a delicate porcelain figurine, and realized I couldn't recall starting it. I knew I'd been working on it yesterday, but the memory of the actual act was gone, replaced by a fuzzy blank. Later, I walked into the kitchen with a specific task in mind, to make tea, and stopped dead, the purpose utterly vanished from my head. The hallucinations started subtly. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned my head. A faint echo of a child's laugh from an empty corridor. I dismissed them, blaming fatigue, the old house playing tricks. But they grew more insistent. I saw a fleeting, gaunt face reflected in a polished antique mirror, only for it to vanish the instant I focused. I was losing time, too. I'd set out to clean a specific room, only to find myself in another part of the house, my tools laid out for a different task, with no memory of the transition. The gaps were small, at first, easily rationalized. Stress. Lack of sleep. But they were becoming larger, more frequent. My own thoughts felt porous. I started to doubt everything. Was I truly Reed, the meticulous restorer, or was I becoming someone else? Was this house merely old, or was it actively twisting my perception? The fragmented stories of madness I'd found online echoed in my mind, no longer just historical curiosities, but terrifying premonitions. This wasn't just a restoration project. This was an assault. And I was losing the battle for my own mind. But the term felt too clinical, too stark for a mere infirmary. The air in this section of the manor was different. Colder, certainly, but also laden with a metallic tang that pricked at the back of my throat, mixed with the usual musty scent of decay. The corridor was narrow, lined with heavy, bolted doors, each one a uniform slab of pitted iron. No windows. Just solid, unyielding walls. I moved slowly, my boots scuffing softly on the uneven flagstones. It wasn't a sound I could pinpoint, more a pressure in my eardrums, a subtle disorientation. I paused at the first door, peering through a small, grimy viewport. Inside, a tiny room, bare save for a rusted iron ring bolted to the floor. The walls were scarred, etched with faint, almost illegible scratches. This wasn't for convalescence. This was for holding. For keeping something, or someone, utterly alone. But then, a flicker at the edge of my vision. I blinked, turning sharply, but there was nothing. My grip tightened on the old lantern I carried, its beam struggling to push back the encroaching gloom. The faint hum intensified, vibrating now through the soles of my feet. It wasn't in my ears, but inside my head, a dry, papery rustle, like old leaves skittering across a forgotten floor. "Who are you?" it seemed to ask, or perhaps, "What are you?" The words were indistinct, fragments, but the implication was clear. My own name, Reed, felt suddenly foreign on my tongue. Why was I here? What was I doing? The walls seemed to press closer, the air growing thick, difficult to draw into my lungs. Then, a memory flickered, not mine. A child's face, pale and tear-streaked, pressed against a viewport just like the one I was looking through. But the face was indistinct, blurring even as I tried to focus, and then it was gone, replaced by the scarred iron. Had I just imagined it? The silence stretched, then broke with a faint, wet drip, drip, drip from somewhere further down the corridor. My hands felt clammy. I could still hear the hum, now with an added, almost imperceptible, scratch, 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 like fingernails on stone, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I took a step back, bumping into the cold stone wall. For a horrifying moment, I couldn't remember which way I had come. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, identical doors mocking my disorientation. A wave of pure, disorienting static washed over me, not a sound, but a feeling, a complete white noise in my head. My vision swam. The distinct lines of the doors wavered, blurring into a continuous, pulsating wall of gray. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them, trying to physically force the distortion away. When I opened them, the corridor was still there, but it felt wrong. The floor seemed to tilt, and the ceiling pressed down, too low, too heavy. Who are you, truly? My own memories, my life, my achievements, felt like borrowed clothes, flimsy and about to rip. I could almost feel something reaching, probing, trying to unspool the very threads of my being. I stumbled forward, needing to move, to break free of this suffocating psychological pressure. My hand brushed against the stone, seeking purchase, and found a small, rough indentation. I restore things. As I pushed myself away from the wall, my gaze fell upon the floor directly beneath where I had just been standing. I knelt, my hands trembling, and carefully pried it free. It was a locket, tarnished silver, so old it was almost black. My fingers worked at the clasp, and with a faint click, it sprang open. Inside, on one side, was a faded, sepia-tone photograph of a young woman with kind, sad eyes. On the other, nestled under a thin, yellowed film, was a single, intricately braided lock of hair, light brown, fine and delicate. A name, almost entirely worn away, was faintly etched into the silver casing on the back, Eliza. Eliza. This wasn't just a locket, it was a fragment of a life, a physical tether to someone who had been here, in these terrible cells. And the entity, I realized with a fresh wave of horror, fed on these very things. Memories. Identity. The essence of who someone was. This locket, this lock of hair, they were all that remained of Eliza, stolen and consumed by whatever malevolent force lurked in these depths. My own grip on myself felt tenuous, like a thread stretched to breaking point. I had to get out. I clutched the locket, its cold metal a stark anchor in the swirling confusion of my mind. The faint scratching sound intensified, right behind me, then in front, then all around. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something rottenly sweet. And for the first time, I wasn't sure what it would find. I stared at the faded stencil, my flashlight beam trembling. But the term felt institutional. Brutal. Not the kind of thing you'd find tucked away in a private residence, no matter how grand or eccentric. A cold certainty settled over me, heavier than the dust in these forgotten passages. This wasn't just a house with a history, it was a trap. Whatever lay beneath the surface, whatever had allowed such a place to exist, it was still here. And it was actively working against me. I spun around, not bothering to close the door to the grim corridor. Escape. That was the only thought clear enough to cut through the growing fog in my head. The idea of spending another night here, letting whatever force was at play continue to chip away at my memories, was unbearable. I moved with a frantic energy I hadn't known I possessed, retracing my steps through the labyrinthine. Lower levels. Up the narrow service stairs, through the echoing kitchen, past the dining room where the phantom clatter of silverware sometimes seemed to linger. The air grew heavier, pressing in on me, making my lungs work harder. The heavy oak front door, my usual exit and entry point, loomed before me. I lunged for the ornate brass handle, twisting it with a desperate urgency. It turned, smooth as ever, but the door didn't budge. I pushed, then pulled, leaning my full weight into it. Nothing. It was as if the wood had swollen to fill the frame, or the bolts had fused with the jamb. I tried again, harder, a low grunt escaping my throat, but the door remained stubbornly, immovably shut. I tried the deadbolt, jamming the key in, twisting it back and forth. It clicked, it turned, it felt open, but the door still held fast. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. No, I muttered, my voice thin and reedy in the cavernous space. I stumbled back, looking around wildly. The windows. My gaze flew to the tall, mullioned windows flanking the door. They were original, beautiful pieces of craftsmanship, but many were nailed shut, covered by heavy, grimy drapes I hadn't yet gotten around to cleaning. The few that weren't obscured were too high, or too small, or simply wouldn't budge. I tried one in the drawing room, wrestling with the ancient sash lock, but it was painted shut, decades of layered enamel binding it tighter than any bolt. Okay, not the door, not the windows. The phone. My phone. Where was it? I patted my pockets, then checked the work table in the foyer where I sometimes left it. Empty. My mind scrambled, trying to recall the last time I'd seen it. Was it in the kitchen? The library? Had I even brought it inside today? I couldn't remember. The details of my morning, of the past few hours, were already dissolving into a hazy, indistinct mess. I ran back to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing loudly on the flagstones. No phone. I scoured the countertops, the small desk I used for paperwork, even rummaged through the drawers. My hands shook as I pulled out an old rotary phone, a relic I'd found in the study, and, on a whim, tried to connect to the defunct landline. I picked up the receiver. Dead. Of course. A low, mocking hum was all I got. A wave of dizziness washed over me. This wasn't right. I was meticulous. I always knew where my tools were, where my phone was. This forgetfulness, this creeping uncertainty, felt deliberate. I stumbled back to the foyer, my head throbbing. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by the very fabric of the house itself. A movement near the grand staircase, just beyond the heavy shadow cast by the newel post. I snapped my head around. But I felt it. A presence. Something vast and ancient, amused by my futile struggles. My gaze fell upon a small, unassuming table tucked into an alcove near the stairs. It was draped with a heavy, velvet cloth, and I hadn't paid it much mind before. Now, something beneath the cloth caught my eye. A glint. I pulled back the fabric, my fingers trembling. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, intricate in its design, lying on a stack of brittle, yellowed papers. I picked up the locket first. It was heavy, cool to the touch. With a fumbling motion, I managed to pry it open. Inside, 2 faded photographs. One, a stern-faced man I didn't recognize. I set the locket down and picked up the papers. They were handwritten in a spidery, looping script that was hard to decipher. They speak of the forgetting, of the slow erosion. The master demands his due. He hungers for the very threads of our being. They took my sister today. To the cells. For her own good, they said. To protect the others from her. Process. My head swam. How much time had already passed since I first set foot in this house? And how much of me was left? The manor groaned around me, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from its very foundations. I was trapped, utterly alone, and the very thing that imprisoned me was devouring my mind, piece by agonizing piece. My fingers trembled, the parchment rustling faintly as I traced the faded, spidery script. This wasn't just some abstract concept. This was a place. A real place, somewhere in this house, or beneath it. The next lines were even more disturbing, revealing a chilling purpose. The document, clearly a journal or a fragmented report from an earlier, forgotten occupant, spoke of containment protocols, memory harvesting, and identity erosion. It wasn't just a metaphor. The master wasn't some symbolic force of decay. It was a parasitic entity, ancient beyond reckoning, drawn to places where the veil between what was and what had been grew thin. It fed not on flesh, but on the intricate, unique tapestry of memories that defined a person. Each cherished experience, every moment of joy or sorrow, every face remembered, every skill learned, these were its sustenance. It was a predator of the self. To keep them away from the entity, to slow its insidious work. But the writer's tone shifted, growing increasingly frantic, the ink smudged in places as if tears or sweat had fallen onto the page. The cells had become something else. A larder. A controlled environment where the entity could graze without fully consuming, extending its feast. It preferred a slow, agonizing erasure, leaving behind a husk that still breathed, still moved, but was utterly, terrifyingly empty. I remembered the previous owners, the forgetting mentioned in the ledger. The vacant stares, the sudden inability to recall loved ones, the slow fade into nothingness. It wasn't senility. It was deliberate. It was the master. My own recent experiences, the gaps in my day, the words I couldn't quite grasp, the faces that blurred at the edges of my recollection, they weren't just stress. They were symptoms. The entity was already feeding. It had found me. The document delved into the entity's origins, hinting at a time before recorded history, a primordial hunger that had merely slumbered, waking periodically when conditions were ripe. The manor, it seemed, wasn't its origin point, but rather a beacon, a nexus of forgotten histories and lingering echoes, perfect for its awakening. Each restoration project, each memory I unearthed and brought back to life, wasn't just my work, it was a banquet bell, ringing for the master. My meticulous efforts, my passion for the past, had been its invitation. My stomach churned, a bitter taste rising in my throat. Then came the final, most terrible revelation, scrawled in a frantic hand that barely clung to legibility. The writer, clearly at the end of their tether, spoke of an appeasement. Not a defeat, for the entity could not truly be killed, only driven back into dormancy, and the cost. The cost was monstrous. It required not just a memory, but the memory. The foundational one. The memory that defined an individual's very existence, the one piece of their past without which they would cease to be them. And it had to be willingly offered. A conscious, deliberate sacrifice of self. The document spoke of the severance, a psychic amputation that left one alive but forever incomplete, a shattered reflection of their former self. The writer had tried to stop it. They had tried to protect the afflicted, to starve the master. But the entity adapted, grew stronger, its hunger more insatiable. This wasn't just about restoring a house anymore. It was about survival. My survival. My identity. And the terrifying implication that perhaps, in this desolate place, I wasn't alone. That someone else, someone whose memories I might cherish, could become the object of its grotesque demand. A low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the stone floor beneath my feet, a sound like a distant, massive tuning fork. My breath hitched in my chest. I wasn't just reading about a threat anymore. I was feeling it. I was living it. The truth, finally revealed, was a sacrifice I might not be able to make. It wasn't just a chilling phrase anymore, it was an anchor, a desperate, terrible clue. This manor, this house that was slowly devouring me piece by piece, had once held something so volatile, so dangerous, that specific, purpose-built containment was required. And if it had been built once, it still existed. Somewhere. But even that flicker felt different now, distorted, like a memory seen through warped glass. Yet, the urgency to act was undeniable. I moved with a renewed, desperate energy, ignoring the growing fuzziness at the periphery of my vision, the way familiar objects occasionally shimmered and shifted. The manor itself seemed to watch me, its ancient timbers groaning in response to my frantic pace. I started in the lowest parts of the house, the forgotten root cellars and the dank crawl spaces I'd previously dismissed as mere structural elements. I dragged away centuries of accumulated debris, rotting crates, broken furniture, the skeletal remains of past lives. My search then led me to the ground floor, specifically focusing on the oldest, most structurally isolated sections. The manor was a labyrinth of additions and renovations, but the core structure, the original house, had a distinct, almost defensive feel to it. I ran my hands over stone walls, searching for seams, for hidden doorways, for any indication of a space deliberately sealed off. My fingers, once so steady and precise in their craft, now often twitched, a tremor that seemed to originate deep within my bones. Hours bled into each other. Plaster cracked, stone groaned, and with a final, sickening scrape, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a narrow, lightless opening. It smelled like absence itself. I squeezed through the opening, my lantern held high. The passage was short, leading into a small, circular chamber. This was it. They were constructed of thick, unmortared stone, with heavy, iron-bound wooden doors that were impossibly thick. The doors themselves were studded with corroded bolts and secured by massive, rusted iron bars that looked like they hadn't been moved in centuries. There were no windows, no ventilation beyond what the crumbling stone allowed. And on the inner surface of each door, etched into the ancient wood, were symbols. My breath hitched. This wasn't for people. Not truly. The dimensions, the symbols, the utter lack of comfort or egress, it was a prison, yes, but also a cage designed to contain something formless, something that fed on the very essence of being. These weren't just cells, they were containers for what I now faced. The symbols, I understood with a jolt that cleared some of the mental fog, were meant to disrupt, to fragment, to starve whatever was inside. They were anti-memory, anti-identity. A desperate, audacious plan began to form, coalescing from the fragments of my deteriorating mind. The entity fed on identity, on memory. It drew me in, consuming my past, blurring my present. The personal sacrifice was immediately clear. It would mean offering up what little remained of me. My own identity, my core essence, would be the bait, the lure. I would have to open myself completely, draw it in, let it consume what was left of Reed, the antique restorer, the man who remembered his parents, his first apprentice piece, the smell of linseed oil. I would become a conduit, a vessel overflowing with the very thing it craved, only to trap it here, in these silent, suffocating cells. The thought was terrifying, a precipice from which my sanity recoiled. But the alternative was slow, complete erasure. At least this way, I could choose. I could make a stand, even if it meant my final act was to cease being. A grim resolve hardened within me. This was my last chance. This was the plan. The air in this forgotten chamber was heavy, tasting of rust and deep, undisturbed dust. I stood before them, my breath misting in the frigid air, the cold seeping into my bones despite the thick layers of clothing. This was it. My plan, cobbled together from fragmented research and desperate intuition, felt both brilliant and utterly insane. The entity fed on memory, on identity, on the very essence of self. What better way to starve it, I reasoned, than to plunge it into absolute sensory deprivation? To cut off every input, every potential thread of thought or feeling it could latch onto? These cells, designed for precisely that, felt like the only answer. I chose the middle cell. My fingers, numb despite my gloves, fumbled with the massive iron bar that secured it. The metal shrieked in protest as I heaved it upwards, a sound that echoed through the stone chamber like a dying animal's cry. Then, with a grunt, I pulled the heavy door inward. Not a physical blow, but a psychic assault that slammed into my mind like a tidal wave. My memories, usually a neat, ordered catalog, suddenly erupted into a kaleidoscopic chaos. Faces flashed before my eyes, the kind face of my mentor, the stern gaze of my father, a fleeting glimpse of a childhood friend whose name I hadn't thought of in decades. It was my voice, yet it wasn't. It was an echo, a mimicry, utterly devoid of warmth or recognition. What is Reed? A collection of moments. Panic began to claw at my throat. I restore. I fix things. I remember. But the entity was relentless. It began to pick at the threads of my identity, unraveling them one by one. My name, Reed, suddenly felt alien, a label someone else had given me. My profession, antique restorer, seemed like a meaningless series of motions performed by a stranger. My core memories, the ones that define me, the smell of linseed oil in my workshop, the feel of ancient wood under my hands, the quiet satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life, became corrupted. The workshop became a dank, dripping cave. The wood felt like rotting flesh. A temporary arrangement of fleeting thoughts. And now, even those are mine. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my temples, as if I could physically hold my mind together. What was the one thing the entity couldn't take? What was unchangeable? The rough texture of the wall under my fingers. The metallic tang in the air. These were real. These were here. I focused on them, letting the physical sensations ground me. As I struggled, a horrifying clarity pierced through the mental fog. The cells. They weren't just for isolation. They were for processing. This wasn't just a prison, it was a crucible. The sensory deprivation wasn't just to starve, it was to refine. To strip away everything until only the raw essence of identity remained, a pure, potent draft for the entity to consume. This was the reveal. These cells were not meant to contain the entity, but to prepare its sustenance. They were a grinder, slowly separating the wheat from the chaff of a human mind, leaving only the purest, most concentrated memories for the entity to devour. The metallic tang wasn't just rust, it was the residue of countless minds that had been flayed here. My stomach lurched. The entity wasn't just taking my memories, it was extracting them, refining them, making them more palatable. And I had walked right into its pantry. A sudden, overwhelming surge of despair threatened to drown me. What was the point? It had already won. I was already gone. But then, a flicker. A memory the entity couldn't corrupt, because it wasn't a memory of doing but of being. The deep, unwavering love I had for my craft, for the silent stories held within ancient objects. The meticulous care I put into every restoration, not for profit, but for the inherent beauty of preservation. That wasn't a moment, it was a core value. You can't take the essence. I pressed my back against the cold stone, forcing myself to stand tall in the suffocating blackness. My plan might have been flawed, but the core idea remained: starve it. I had to make myself indigestible. I emptied my mind, not of memories, but of value. I imagined myself as a blank slate, a gray, uninteresting wall. No vibrant colors, no intricate patterns, no fascinating history. Just nothing. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated in my teeth. It was a sound of frustration, of hunger denied. It thrashed against my mental shield, throwing images of my greatest fears, my deepest regrets, against me. I saw my manor crumbling around me, my hands unable to stop it. I saw myself, old and forgotten, staring into an empty future. But I held fast to the gray, the unremarkable, the utterly unappetizing nothingness I had become. The assault lessened, then receded. The kaleidoscopic chaos in my mind settled, leaving behind a profound exhaustion, a raw, aching emptiness where my identity had been so fiercely defended. I was still Reed, but a Reed stripped bare, battered and bruised, but unbroken. I had survived, for now. I had faced the entity in its own feeding ground, and I had, somehow, held on to myself, but the cost. The cost was immeasurable. The cold stone against my back was a memory, an anchor point I'd clung to even as the world inside my head had dissolved. Make myself What had I been trying to do? It was a sound I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps I had, and it had simply been swallowed by the greater cacophony of my unraveling. Now, in the stark silence that followed whatever had just happened, it was the only sound. That, and the ragged, shallow breaths that were undeniably my own. My eyes fluttered open, or so I assumed. There was no light to register, only a deeper, more profound blackness than before. Every muscle felt alien, stretched and then contracted in unfamiliar ways. Had I moved? Had I screamed? I ran a hand over my face, feeling the rough stubble, the unfamiliar contours of my jaw. My fingers felt like clumsy tools, disconnected from the command center of my brain. There was a faint metallic tang on my tongue, like old blood or rusted iron, and the air itself was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid and faintly sweet, like ozone after a lightning strike, but also like old, burnt sugar. The entity was gone. Not banished, not destroyed, but absent. The crushing weight that had been a constant companion, a psychic parasite burrowing into my consciousness, had lifted. The relief should have been overwhelming, a torrent of joyous release. Instead, there was just an emptiness, a vast, echoing cavern where my thoughts used to be. Read. Yes. That was it. Read. My profession? Antique restorer. The words formed, correct, logical, but they felt like facts recited from a textbook, not lived experiences. Like I was reading my own biography written by a stranger. Nothing. A blank screen, a corrupted file. This wasn't a temporary amnesia, the shock of a traumatic event. This was a systematic excision. It had taken what it needed, and in my desperate attempt to make myself indigestible, to offer a meal it couldn't consume, I had perhaps starved myself. Or worse, I had fed it something vital, something that defined the I that was Reed, leaving only the shell. I stumbled forward, my outstretched hand brushing against a rough, damp stone wall. Where was I? Had I been here before? How long? Days? Weeks? Years? The hum intensified for a fraction of a second, then receded. It was as if the very structure of this place, this ancient, forgotten prison, was settling, exhaling after a long, arduous struggle. The entity, in its final moments of desperation or perhaps its final act of malice, had left its mark. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into my sockets, trying to force a memory, any memory, into existence. My childhood home? My parents' faces? The first antique I ever restored? Each attempt was met with the same blank wall, a smooth, featureless surface that reflected nothing back. It was like trying to remember a dream I'd never had. The entity had fed on memory, on identity. My victory, if it could be called that, was in denying it a final, satisfying feast. But the cost. The cost was everything. My fingers traced the rough grit of the floor, searching for something familiar, a pattern, a scar, anything that could tell me who I was, what I had done. The silence was no longer a relief. It was a vast, terrifying canvas upon which my absent memories refused to paint. It was a label, a sound, but the person it belonged to felt irrevocably lost, scattered like dust, blown away by a wind I couldn't remember. I had one, yes. The manor house was perhaps safe, its ancient horror contained. But I was not. The scars were not visible on my skin, but they were etched deep into the very fabric of my being, an irreversible, terrifying testament to a victory that felt more like a final, devastating defeat. The cold stone against my back was a memory, an anchor point I'd clung to even as the world inside my head had dissolved. I remembered the plan: make myself indigestible. Make myself The word, the precise intention, snagged on something rough in my mind, a torn canvas where a clear image should. My eyes fluttered open to a flat, gray ceiling. Concrete. The air was stale, still. I pushed myself up from a thin cot, my limbs stiff, heavy. This was it then. A single, heavy door, no window. A small, reinforced slot near the floor for food. The light, a single bulb set behind a mesh, cast a weak, unchanging glow. There was no sound beyond the dull thrum of my own blood in my ears, no scent but the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant in something else. An echo of dust, of forgotten things. My mind felt like a freshly wiped slate, smooth and vast, yet with faint, indelible smudges around the edges, hints of what had once been. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy door groaned open. A burly security officer, his face impassive, gestured me out. "You're clear, read." Clear. The word felt hollow. The interrogator, a gaunt man in a plain suit, met me in a bare room with a metal table and 2 chairs. He watched me with an unnerving intensity. "We have no record of your claims, read. No manor in that location. No missing persons reported in decades. Nothing." His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "You were found disoriented, wandering near a derelict industrial site far from any habitation. You spoke of impossible things." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "We've tried to help you. But you are uncooperative, unreachable." He produced a folder. "Your family is gone. No living relatives. Your accounts are dormant. There's nothing for you to return to." He slid a paper across the table. "This is your release. You're free to go. We've arranged temporary accommodation in the city, a small stipend. No further contact. Consider it a fresh start. A fresh start. I nodded, signed the paper without a tremor. My hand felt alien, capable. I felt nothing towards his words, no anger, no sadness, no confusion. Just a quiet acceptance. The had worked. I was indigestible. The city was a blur of noise and hurried faces. A small, sterile flat awaited me, smelling faintly of stale air and cheap detergent. I bought new clothes, simple, anonymous. I tried to find work, to resume my craft, but the tools felt foreign in my hands. The intricate details, the slow, meditative process of restoration, no longer held me. My focus felt different. Sharper, perhaps, but also detached. I could see the flaws, the cracks, the decay with chilling precision, but the beauty, the history, the soul of the piece, they were lost to me. Just objects. I found myself watching people. On the street, in cafes. Their expressions, their gestures, their fleeting emotions. I absorbed it all, the way a sponge might, but without feeling saturated. There was no empathy, no connection, just an endless, quiet observation. It was like watching a play where I knew all the lines, all the motivations, but understood none of the stakes. One evening, I found a forgotten box in the back of a closet. My old belongings, untouched. Inside, a photograph. It was me. Read. Standing in front of the manor, years ago, before it all. My face was younger, softer, eyes alight with a meticulous passion. I remembered that man. Or rather, I remembered the concept of that man. He was a stranger. I had stripped myself bare, made myself an empty vessel, devoid of the specific memories and identity that the entity had craved. I had become the negative space, the absence. Hoping it would pass through me, finding nothing to latch onto. But the emptiness. The absolute, profound emptiness that now resided where Reed's identity once was. It was a new kind of presence. A quiet, persistent hum that vibrated beneath my skin. It didn't consume. It observed. It learned. It was. I stood before the mirror, the photograph still in my hand. The face staring back at me was mine, yet it wasn't. The eyes were too calm, too still, lacking the frantic spark of a soul in turmoil. They were the eyes of something ancient, something that had finally found its perfect, portable vessel. I had made myself indigestible, yes. But the entity, in its cunning, had simply shifted its diet. It no longer needed the memories of a place. It needed the memories from a place. And I, the blank slate, the walking absence, was now perfectly capable of acquiring them, of carrying them, of becoming a conduit. The victory was a delusion. I hadn't defeated the entity. I had become its ultimate form. I was the silent observer, the quiet collector, walking through the world, a living, breathing archive of everything I encountered, everything I absorbed, everything I would never truly feel. The horror wasn't that the entity was still out there. The horror was that it was in here. And it was me.